to welcome on your behalf Dr. Paddy Fitzgerald of the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies. He's lecturer and development officer of said same organisation, and he's going to speak to us this evening on emigration from the Dungannon Donaghmore area, and I suspect he'll be talking about the Irish Emigration database, and he'll be talking about the amazing data, whatever, which is or are available to us in an age of digitisation. So without further ado, please could I ask you for a round of applause for Dr. Paddy Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Oops. Thanks very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you for coming out on a Friday evening, especially Friday the 13th. It's a bit of a risk, isn't it? You know, stepping out. So nice weather, could have been a barbecue, but you're here. And I probably should warn one or two of you whose faces I recognise that this is quite similar, not exactly the same, but quite similar to a talk that I had given in Donaghmore over a decade ago in the Heritage Centre. But essentially what I want to try and do is effectively two things. Initially I want to try and set a canvas, if you like, a broader canvas against which we look at the local immigration patterns by trying to draw out some of the main characteristic or features of Irish emigration, particularly in the long 19th century. So that's really the first part of the talk, and then move in, as Aidan hinted, to look at specific evidence related to Dungannon and district from the Irish Emigration database. So that's the agenda. So the first part is really just an opportunity to try and pick out some broad features of Irish emigration, particularly transatlantic emigration. And a way to try and do that is to set the pattern from Ireland into a broader context, a context of transcontinental emigration of over 50 million Europeans in the long 19th century, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars through to the First World War. And by doing that in a comparative way, what features of Irish emigration might we pick out? So the first thing perhaps that stands out when you look at Irish emigration, particularly you might argue emigration from the northern province of Ulster, is what we could call persistent. So right through from the event remembered to us as the Flight of the Earls, 14th September 1607, O'Neill and O'Donnell headed for Madrid but end up in Rome. That iconic moment was an incredibly important, iconic, symbolic starting point, if you like, for the development of the Irish diaspora. And from that moment in the early 17th century right through to the present, we have seen this extraordinarily consistent outward movement of people from the island of Ireland, and particularly, as I say, the province of Ulster. I mean, it is interesting just to note that the image of people leaving today, although we are, as we learnt just a fortnight ago, in an era of net immigration in both Northern Ireland and the Republic, within that, although the net numbers are people coming into the countries, there is still significant outward migration within that. In 2012, actually, there was an article in a local paper here in Dongannon, drawing attention to the fact that though there is significant inward migration, there is still quite heavy outward migration. And I don't want to get drawn into the B word that was mentioned earlier, but it's probably quite likely that we will see, if events unfold as they seem bound to do, a return to net emigration in the not too distant future. There's no doubt whatever that the dominant spectre of the Great Famine in many ways overshadows the way we think about Irish migration right across the globe. So for example, if you say to somebody on the streets of Dungannon, Belfast, Dublin, London, San Francisco, Sydney, Irish immigration, what they're likely to say to you in reply is the famine. It's an extraordinarily strong connector. And the traumatic events of the years 1845 to 51 have very strongly branded all Irish migration with that kind of traumatic motif, if you like. Here are the figures on right beside the Jeannie Johnson and Epic Ireland on the Liffey, the Rowan Gillespie figures from the late 90s. An image of a group of men, Ancient Order of Hibernian Lodge meeting in the plains of Minnesota in 1911, and very probably what motivated them, those men, to come out and meet weekly in Minnesota in 1911 was the memory of the famine and the construction in their mind's eye of the responsibility for the famine. So it had a huge impact in the diaspora in terms of bolstering Irish nationalism. And of course it still continues to this day, despite Tony Blair's apology, what was it, how many years ago? It's still a very, very potent element of contemporary Republican nationalist projection. That is West Belfast, one of the murals in West Belfast. Now, I suppose this links very closely to what I'm trying to talk about tonight in terms of looking at this area of Dungannon and district, is that people from specific locales in Ireland didn't actually scatter randomly across the globe throughout the 19th, 20th centuries or before. There were quite intimate links and bonds of connection across thousands of miles between specific places here in Ireland and specific places out there in diaspora. James Brennan's painting of 1875, The American Letter, shows us a typical scene of a young girl reading a letter and the father with what is probably a prepaid ticket in the hand of the father, probably to take the elder daughter out to join a sister or brother in a specific locale out there in diaspora. And these mechanisms by which migrants made these moves formed, as I say, these quite intimate bonds of connection across very long distances. Maybe one of the most interesting ways of illustrating that is a link between two islands. On the left we have from the air Arranmore off the west of Donegal. And emigrants who left Arranmore from the early 1850s through 3 generations, the vast majority of them, perhaps 80%, went to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. So you've a very, very strong link connector between two specific islands across the Atlantic Ocean, and that's typical of what the geographers refer to as chain migration, and the mechanisms through families and neighbours that sustained those migration links between particular locales across oceans. Now, when we look at the European patterns, what you find is that of the outflow in the 19th century from the continent of Europe, it was predominantly young men who made up the majority of the outflow. Most instances, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the outflow from continental European countries, ethnic groups, were male. What was different about Ireland was that the gender balance, in contrast, was very even right throughout the post-famine decades. In fact, by the tail end of the 19th century, the 1890s, women were in a slight majority amongst the outflow from Ireland. So Erskine Nichols' painting of 1865 offers us actually a wonderfully accurate dust cover for a book on the subject of post-famine emigration. Young single adults, male and female, probably already in the employment market but not yet in the marriage market, heading off in their Sunday best, in this case probably to go to Galway and take ship for America. And one of the factors, at least, which was behind it, there were many, but one of the most important ones was, I suppose, a consolidation of a stereotype, Bridget the housemaid in America, because that was, domestic service was the single biggest employer for young women from Ireland in 19th century, particularly later 19th century America. And that was one of the skills that they could take with them to America, to knowledge of domestic service, but also textiles, particularly here in Ulster. Significant numbers of women who had experience of the textiles, production of textiles, particularly linen, could bring that to, for example, the textile mills of places like New England. Now, the rate of return is a really interesting dimension of emigration, and you might be surprised at the statistics regarding European return migration. And I often ask groups who come into our centre from North America what they think is the proportion of the emigrant flow from Europe that ultimately returned to live in Europe. Most of them put their hands up enthusiastically and say, oh, 5%, maybe 10%. And the answer actually is in and around 35%. So just over a third of the outflow of those 50 million from Europe actually returned to the continent of Europe to live permanently in Europe. Certain parts of Europe very, very high. The Balkans, parts of Russia, up to 90%. Southern Italy, 2/3 returned. Now what's different about Ireland is that it's the second lowest in the league table of return. The very lowest is European Jews, but it's estimated that around 10% and only 10% of the Irish transatlantic migrant flow ultimately returned to Ireland. So in essence, it was very much a permanent decision, something which was for keeps if you decided to emigrate. And that might be connected to another characteristic of Irish emigration, which was the ritual of departure. What happened in essence the night, very often, prior to departure across much of rural Ireland in the later 19th century, although it happened earlier than that. Thomas Mellon, for example, in 1816 describes the essence of an American wake in the departure of his grandparents. So the point in a sense here is that the American or living wake, as the departure was marked with the usual collection of song, storytelling, sitting up overnight with the emigrant to the point when dawn breaks and they walk with the emigrant to a significant point in the landscape where emotively they look back at the homestead, and then the emigrants walk on or go on with their cart towards the port, and those who have been part of the wake return to the clachan, the townland. So this is a highly charged, emotionally charged, and I think quite consciously emotionally charged event, which more than anything perhaps was tied into the importance of planting the image of the home farm in the minds of young immigrants who it was relied upon very often to remember to send back remittance. If they could, once they arrive in the New World destination, to send back money to allow the small farm in rural Ireland to continue. As a part of the process of outward flow, we can look at the effects of inheritance patterns. Effectively in the 19th century, one of the significant changes across rural Ireland was the gradual movement away through the century from partable inheritance, by which the small farms were broken up amongst the inheriting sons, to a position by the later 19th century where increasingly it was a process of primogeniture, by which the eldest, not always the eldest, but normally the eldest son who inherits the farm, and that of course leaves the question, what happens to the other siblings? This, if you can make it out, is the McMorrow family in Bullyboy, Kilty Clogher, County Leitrim. And there in the 1901 census, you'll find 5 children to the family. By 1911, the eldest son, John, is described as farmer's son, and the other 4 are no longer in the census. And the probability is that they have scattered. They've gone overseas to seek work that was not available in rural Leitrim. Final little footnote I just put in the other day, because I think it's quite important in terms of the context of what we're talking about when we move to talk about Dungannon. The way that a lot of people construct Ulster emigration is not closely accorded to what actually happened. What I mean by that is when you say Ulster emigration, to a lot of people, they think 18th century. They talk about the Presbyterian, predominantly Presbyterian migration of the 18th century, and they then segment that into a binary and say there were 2 migrations. There were Presbyterians who went in the 18th century, and then you have Catholics leaving in the immediate pre-famine, famine and post-famine periods. Marshall in 1943 published a booklet, Ulster Sails West, which very much was in the drive of propaganda intended to give us a view of that migration as a bulwark to the Unionist case in the mid-40s and as an answer to Dublin. And that was of course the time when the American GIs were in Northern Ireland. If you look at Hutchison, interestingly, which many of the local historians would be very familiar with, the only reference in Hutchison to emigration again is 18th century, no mention of the much more voluminous migration of the 19th century. And when we come to the construct of thinking about Presbyterian emigration as essentially an 18th century phenomenon, relatively recent work by Rankin Shirling demonstrates very clearly that the majority of immigrants, particularly his sample is looking at Presbyterian ministers. And Presbyterian ministers across the Atlantic, they reached their peak quite clearly and significantly in the 1840s at the time of the famine. And it's, I think, pretty unlikely that the profile of Presbyterian emigration, and there's lots of other supporting evidence, was anything different. Most Ulster Presbyterians crossed the Atlantic, the peak, probably 7 times greater than the outflow of any time in the 18th century, is at the height of the famine. So it's quite important again. I think there has been a certain extent to which we have airbrushed out the experience of Ulster Protestants as migrants in the 1840s. I would argue that it was much, much more significant than the general picture allows for. So, on to say something about the Irish Emigration Database. One of the things is that this is really a bit of a daddy when it comes to digital projects, because it was as early as the 1980s when digital provided sponsorship and hardware to allow the project to get underway. And it really is very early in terms of the history of digitisation projects, the Irish Emigration Database. There you have Chris McIver, former librarian at the Folk Park, looking at an early form of the database. We have on the database over 33,000 transcribed digitised documents. You can keyword search. They're divided into about 17 what we call chapters, never sure that's the right word, but 17 different types of documents. So it's intended, and always was intended, to be quite broad in terms of the collection of the material, rather than focusing on a particular type of document like passenger lists or emigrant letters. Its scope is really quite broad. It's now available, has been available since 2011 on a website on the internet, www.dipam.ac.uk, in collaboration with Queen's in Belfast. So you can search it on the internet, and I hope that you enjoy doing that. I should say that when you search Dungannon, you'll find probably hundreds of documents, and I'm only, obviously, you'll be delighted to hear, you'll get out by midnight, that I'm only going to show you a sample here this evening. So one of the documents I wanted to share with you at the outset are shipping advertisements, and these appear in the newspapers right the way through from the 18th century into the 20th century. And the first one that we're looking at here is drawn from, this is how the document appears on screen, and there's the highlighted term, the search term of Dongannon. This is drawn from the Belfast newsletter on the 23rd of February 1773. That date is interesting for 2 reasons. I mean, the early 1770s, before the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, was a period of quite intense emigration, probably the heaviest or second heaviest period in the 18th century in terms of outward migration to America. The other date is the 23rd of February, when the advert actually appears, although the sailing, it is noted earlier, I think is in March, which again reminds us that at that time under sail there was a distinct emigrant season. So here is an advert appearing in February, priming the market, as they would think of it, for a departure in March. And March normally signalled, quite often around St Patrick's Day, the inauguration, the beginning of a season of emigration that would normally wind up in and around September, October. There's a number of features in it. It mentions specifically the captain of the vessel, McCutcheon, and it of course lauds his humanitarian nature and his record and experience on the crossing, which is obviously what you want as a prospective migrant to be told. It mentions servants and good terms offered to those who would go as indentured servants crossing to America for a period of signing a bond that would tie them to indentured servitude for perhaps a period of 4 or 5 years. But the specific mention here is where are we? The name of the individual in Dungannon. Yes, by applying to the owners, John Patterson and Henry Oatman, or Captain McCutcheon, who were found, Mr. Potters in North Street. Mr. Merrick Bell of Dungannon is the specific agent who you would have approached had you been living in Dungannon in order to gain passage on the ship Betsy, sailing from Newry for Newcastle or Philadelphia in the Delaware port. So I don't know if any local historians recognise the Merrick Bell name, but that was the person you would have approached in 1773 in Dungannon. Moving forward over a century to 1888 and the Armagh Guardian, we're looking at migration through the Anchor Line. This was basically emigration through Derry. You would have now, with the Anchor and Allen lines, you would have got a train, as this advertisement describes at the bottom, from Armagh. The train would leave 7:15 a.m, making its way through Dungannon and on to Derry. When you got to Derry, you would have got onto a little tender. Rather than leaving the famous Derry Quay, you now would have taken the tender up to Moville and then been taken out to a large steamship, in this case a steamship called the City of Rome, which was a regular on the passage across the Atlantic from Moville. Had you wished again to acquire a passage on that vessel in 1888, and again it's interesting to note 12th of October, so now in 1888 you've moved into autumn and winter departures rather than the season of the age of sail. But there are two actually might be of interest. One is P. Flanagan in Dungannon as the agent for the Anchor Line steamers, and then at the very bottom in Benbourbon Moy, don't know which of the two he was based, Samuel Robinson Jr. So two different options, quite close by in terms of acquiring a ticket on the Anchor Line service. And then finally we have in 1911, on the 8th of December 1911, the White Star liners, and they're mentioned somewhat prophetically underneath is a 45,000 ton Titanic, and we all know what happened there, but don't forget there were 113 emigrants on board that particular vessel. But this is advertising sailings from Queenstown, today's Cove, and the agent that you would have gone to in Dongannon at that time was James McElhone, 42 Irish Street, Dungannon. So there's a very specific reference to the address, and this is a bit of a hunch, and I'm not a Dungannon man, but I think 42 Irish Street might have become a travel agency subsequently, and there may be a link between that, because that did happen, that the emigrant agencies transitioned into travel agents subsequently as the century wore on. But I don't know, again, that name McElhone is worth hanging on to, because the name comes up again in a letter subsequently, and I'm just wondering if there is a local connection. Do consult on the database, primarily for family history genealogical reasons. But I suppose in some ways one of the things as an historian is that the actual manifests or passenger lists actually generally tell us relatively little. This is just an example. This is from 1811, I think it is, one of those windows in the Revolutionary War period when emigration is operating across the Atlantic again, and it just gives you two names and the places from which they came. That's it. No ages or anything further, no townland, just mention of Mrs. J. Kennedy, Donaghmore, Tyrone, and James Moore, Donaghmore, Tyrone. So very often the lists themselves don't give us a great deal of information. Now, people from Donaghmore and indeed Dungannon will be very familiar with this particular source. It's in Proney, and this is the reminiscences, notes and reminiscences of James Brown, 1904 to 5. Notes and reminiscences dictated to me during the winter by my father, by Nora Brown. Associated, I think, with the soapworks in the town, and there were just two extracts from that I picked out as I thought were interesting. The first thing I can remember, this is 1828, remembering back to 1828. The first thing I can remember is a servant of ours, Mary Mullen, going to America on St. Patrick's Day, 1828. She and the rest of her party drove to Belfast in a cart to sail thence to America. They took with them provisions for the journey, chiefly oat cakes, as then was the custom. The outward voyage averaged 30 days, but occasionally it was 6 or 7 weeks, and on these occasions provisions ran short and the poor people were in danger of starvation. So when you think oat cakes, you probably think of something quite nice that you could put your cheese on. But one of the things about the oat cake was that it was very durable, and you could again moisten it. It was quite a hardtack, that again would have been used by the Navy, and it was one of those substances or foodstuffs that you could take with you and would last. So if you got into the scenario in which you were going beyond 35, 40 days, it was exactly the kind of material that could keep you, sustain you in time, but not overly pleasant probably to actually eat. Now, you will all probably be familiar with the, and I'm not, but I'm sure Ian in the front row and others are, of the 1841 electoral shenanigans between Mr. Falls and Lord Northland. But one of the consequences of that, noted in the James Brown diary, was the boycotting which followed the successful, I think, election of Lord Northland, caused many of the landed families to boycott woolen drapers in Dungannon who had sided with Falls. The local gentry boycotted them and brought their goods from Silas Weir of Cookstown. Silas Weir and the Weir family connection feature in the letters on the Irish Emigration database. Quite an active trade through Liverpool and transatlantic, so the Weirs again were strong transatlantic connections. This boycotting affected some so severely that they had to emigrate to America, amongst these being Henry Oliver and Richard Tenner. And although this seemed a hardship at the time, the families have both succeeded much better in America than they ever could have done in Ireland. So I just took a wee look, because we have a biography of Henry Oliver, with whom some of you may well be familiar, the Pittsburgh steel magnate, originally from Dungannon. And the book by Henry Oliver Evans has a photograph, probably taken, I would guess, around the early, probably late 30s maybe, 1930s. And it says, the square of Dungannon, County Tyrone, north of Ireland, an interesting construction. Oliver was born in the second house on the right. So, I think that's right. Is that the house that the Olivers occupy? You will learn, no doubt, next Friday. Bit of pressure there, Ian. I don't, but there may be a blue plaque there, is there? Ulster History Circle, does anyone know?
No, there's no, but there's an Oliver who was a saddle maker in Perry Street.
Okay, right. Probably part of the same family. Yeah.
I think it was at the top of Church Street, Ian.
Oh, you're right.
Right.
At the top of Church Street. Yep.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Just around the corner from that.
Yeah. So I don't know how much, this is always an interesting question. The Henry Oliver, memory of Henry Oliver, the name, the legacy is still known in and around Dongannon. But I mean, in terms of his role in Pittsburgh, and I would be interested myself, I didn't get time to look into it, but whether there were connections with the Mellons, who of course were bankers, and bankrolling things like Oliver's steelworks in Pittsburgh. But that would be interesting to follow up on. The other one I just quickly discovered that Tenner was associated with Clockbean House, which is where I get my goose every year for Christmas. As some of you may be familiar with Clockbean Farm shop. So I don't know actually if Lorna's lives in Clockbean House, but that is apparently where Tenner was from. I've just now extracted some pithy quotes, extracts, gobbets from emigrant letters that relate to the Dungannon area. Annie Hagan has quite a lot of correspondence on the database, and I particularly like this one. Annie goes out and joins her brother James in New York City in the early 1880s. And here on the 11th of November 1883, she writes back to Dungannon to her sister Mary, and she says as follows: "There was 2 holidays in this city last week, one of them James the brother, and I went down to Jersey City, spent a nice day in B. McElhone's. On our way going, James says to me, 'You will be a Yankee after this day. There's a joke in this city that you're never a true Yankee till you've been to Jersey City.'" So it's just a really interesting little marker. There are both formal and informal markers of the process of integrating into American society, the Yankee world of New York. And one of those is the holiday, where you go down to the coast and Jersey City, and then when you come back from that, that's you. Now that's a wee marker. Now you're a true Yankee. Now you've been accepted. It's part of the ritual of becoming an American, becoming a New Yorker. And a photograph there of a party, again travelling on the holiday period down to the seacoast of Jersey. We tend to probably think that emigrants were likely to write back to a brother or a sister and say, everything's wonderful, come on over. And indeed many did. But I think it's useful to kind of think that there was a traffic light system. That's the way I think of it, that the correspondent could give a red light, an amber light, or a green light. And of course those could be perfectly sensible things to do. If, for example, in 1893, when the American economy turns down steeply, you would contact a brother and say, don't come this year. They might redirect and go to Scotland. They might postpone for another year till the economy in America recovers. But this quotation is John Hall, Washington County in Pennsylvania, and he's writing to his sister Maggie Black, who's in Ranfurly Terrace, on the 27th of November 1888. And it's just to show us that they don't always, say, yeah, everything's wonderful here. He says, the ideas of people at home about America are all a mistake. You ask me how I like this country, and for my candid opinion as to your coming out here, I do not like it at all. And any person who can live at home at all had better stay there, for in this country I can neither see comfort nor pleasure. So that's quite a ringing kind of red light to put off the sister and others who he's conscious of at home. But he probably is feeling off a memory from a younger man who listened to maybe reports from immigrant letters being circulated of this land of opportunity. But for many migrants who went to America, one of the things that they repeatedly emphasised was the danger of going to America and falling sick or growing old, in that the safety net that society at home could offer was not replicated in America. I suppose in some ways we still see remnants of that about today's America. You go to America, what happens if you get ill? There isn't a national health service, there isn't the mechanisms to support you in times of poverty, etc. So there is that sense of which you're vulnerable in the new world. And one individual migrant again is giving that message reconnaissance back to the sister in Ireland. Talking again about the kind of networks, this local sense of connectedness across the ocean. So here's James Hagan, again the brother we mentioned earlier, in New York City, writing to the sister again, Mary, here in Dungannon on the 20th January 1884. And he writes as follows: Annie does not feel the least lonely. There's scarcely a day or night passes that we have not some person from Dungannon or the neighbourhood in with us. There is nothing happens in or about Dungannon that we don't hear the next few weeks afterwards. I thought you'd get a laugh, wouldn't you? You get, the jungle drums were rumbling of gossip and news and all of that. So it is a wonderful illustration, isn't it, really, of how that, here's Dungannon, and then there's a community out there in New York, and they're coming and going from each other's houses and tenements, and the news is flowing, and they're sitting around the hearth chatting about so-and-so back home. They want to keep their image of the home place updated. They don't want it to freeze in time. And there are actually quite interesting references throughout the letters on the database to the demand by the 1880s, 1890s for people in the States to get newspapers sent out to them. So they would want a newspaper from here, so they would sit and could sit poring through the newspaper and updating themselves about what was happening at home. As I mentioned earlier, as important as any newspaper, or more so even, was another document which was money, and particularly postal orders, such as this. Elizabeth Hagan, who's in Windermere in the northwest of England, to her cousin Mary, writing to her cousin Mary in Irish Street here on the 12th of February 1877. She says, I have sent her £5. I've sent here £5 to help her along, as she is left in a very lonely place, and we expect Brother John a lovely construction, for to send her some money, as many pounds she sent home when she could spare it. So there is again that network trying to assist somebody in a difficult position within the family diaspora, as we might call it, but also that sense of obligation and duty, that because she had sent remittances when she could afford them, that there was an onus again for the family to respond when she was in need. I think that was a very, very important perception of how the system of remittance sending and mutual support within the family diaspora worked. just some commentary from the correspondence, which I thought was quite interesting. Here Annie Hagan again, writing from New York to the sister on the 1st of January, New Year's Day in 1892, where she says, Yankees are worse than the English for different dishes. Which is a really short, pithy little comment, but it makes you think that obviously there was a perception, maybe, based on the big house, that English, if that's taken to mean landed families here, who were by the standards of those lower down the social spectrum, having a great variety in their diet and what was served at table. But that this was as nothing to the cosmopolitan nature of the foodways that were on show in New York by 1892. You had the beginnings of very heavy Italian immigration into New York. You already had migration from Asia, from Germany. So you really had in the districts of New York City an incredible variety of different dishes available, many of which somebody used to a very Irish diet of potatoes and meat would perhaps, or maybe not even meat, would have found something remarkable to comment on. Dressways as well as foodways caught the eye, and here Maggie Blacks, who's in Chicago in June, very hot place to be, is writing to the sister Adela here in Dungannon and writes as follows. And this is again showing you the little network of familiarity. She says, Mr. Anderson came over here about a week ago, up the street of course, with no coat on, just his pants and a vest. One could not do so in Belfast or Dungannon without being talked of. I washed yesterday and had nothing but my chemise and skirt on, and even so was parboiled. So climate, the adjustment to people used to Dungannon, where it does well to scrape over 70 in June, to Chicago where it's pumping up towards 100 degrees. So, I mean, the very thought of somebody, from Dungannon, Mr. Anderson, making his way down the street in the Long Johns or whatever, being, a sight that would have been thought, I'm looking for the right word, something that would raise talk if it happened in Dungannon. And then parboil, they just sweat. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but for people who had made that adjustment, just the heat of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia in summer, and the relentless sweat, particularly if you were involved, as very many men and women were, in hard work. You could imagine that would have been, by the end of the day, you'd have been going home in clothes that were drenched. Some examples came from newspapers which carry a lot of interesting bits and pieces of information. This is the Vindicator, the Belfast paper, in May 1846, where it's simply under the headline, 20 inmates of Dongannon Workhouse sailed for America. 20 young persons, inmates of the Dongannon Union Workhouse, took their departure on Tuesday last for America. They sailed from this town. So at the height of the famine in 1846, assisted emigration through the Poor Law Union, taking inmates from Dungannon Workhouse to Belfast and onward to America. And obviously the poor law unions were very keen to try and get involved in assisted emigration to lessen the burden. They were very concerned about long-term inmates who would place a heavy burden on the poor rates in any particular district. It's probably, most people would maybe exaggerate in their heads the extent of assisted emigration during the famine. It was probably no more than about 1 in 20 of the outflow got any assistance, either from the poor law unions or from the landed estates to emigrate. So 95% of the migrant flow was not being assisted directly, other than by family members to emigrate. This is a little piece that appeared. I think it was in the Tyrone Con. Yeah, it is Barney McCool, with whom the older members of the will remember Barney McCool would write in the Tyrone Con. This was in January 1971, but he makes reference to a place called Dungannon. What am I right in saying that? Yeah, I think it's just
at the bottom, yeah.
Yeah. And his speculation was there's a place called Dungannon that's been given the name Dungannon in Canada, in Ontario, but he puts that down, speculates that these were people, the early settlers there were from Donegal, and hence they gave the town the name Dungannon. Now, I'm not saying that's not the case, it could have been, but probably more likely were surveyors and administrators who were important in giving places or translating places from Ireland out into the diaspora. I did bring a book from the library, The Origins and Meaning of Place Names in Canada, which actually has a reference to Dungannon, which is in the southern part of Ontario. And then, just as another example, I currently we just received this lovely book, another plug, the Graham Letters, Graham McWhinney up in Sixtowns near Draperstown, 92 emigrant letters languishing in a biscuit tin, which he has now produced in a wonderful edited volume. And so he'd asked me to write a foreword for it. But in this again, there are letters being sent back to Sixtowns in the 1840s from Dungannon, Ohio. So again, another example in the United States as well as Canada of the transference of that name across the globe. Another interesting little project, somebody put an exhibition on about 7 or 8 years ago of the use of Derry or Londonderry, and I think there were 13 different Derrys or Londonderrys out there across the globe. One of the things that they did record regularly in the newspapers locally were births, deaths and marriages. So just a couple of examples from the Belfast newsletter. In 1862 it reports Mullen, November the 10th, the death at New York, Anne Mullen, a native of the parish of Dongannon, County Tyrone, aged 38 years. Of course 1862 is slap bang in the middle of the American Civil War. Don't know if there's any connection or not. Could be, but that was reported then. In 1878 you have McKnight, April the 21st at St. Louis, USA. Eliza, daughter of the late David McKnight of Dongannon, late of Lawrence Street in Belfast. So again, another Dongannon connection. But the reportage of deaths a regular feature in the death columns back home. On a lighter note, a marriage. Here's the marriage of McGee Cullen on February the 12th at Clockcore by the Reverend Francis McKenna, PP, Lawrence McGee, Esquire, late of America, third son of the late Charles McGee of Dungannon, to Lizzie, second daughter of James Cullen, Abercorn Square, Strabane. So again, a returned migrant. But it's worth noting, in fact, what is interesting is the extent to which quite localised marriage patterns can be detected in the diaspora. You will find people from the same townland, often from the same parish, marrying in parts of the United States, Canada, Australasia, etc. So those links and connections, the chain migration I described earlier, obviously shaped. And if you were a parent at home, you would be confident, I would suggest, you might not be confident, but you might be confident to know that the person who your daughter or son is marrying is of a family who is known to you. So you might, again, that could be a factor in those decisions. Okay, that is the talk complete, and thank you very much for your attention.